My name is Eva Cordero. I graduated from Amherst in class of 2018, and I was a sophomore during Amherst Uprising. And kind of thinking back to the very beginning, sitting in the initial sit-in, I remember sitting on the stairs between the first and second floors of Frost. I was sitting next to my best friend Araceli, and I remember it was just such a giant wave of catharsis. We were sitting kind of with a view of the whole room, and so you were just getting you could really see everyone's faces, and you could really feel the energy that was resonating in the room. And so I think the initial feeling was catharsis. And kind of from there, it started to build up to momentum, to this intensity that would really carry for the next few days. I think in the first few hours, I was really just sitting, just really taking everything in. It's weird because even when I think about it, I can feel very, intense emotions rise up for me, even though it's been so many years. For me, my uncle had died 2 days before, and it was the fourth loss in my family. So that year, it was the fourth loss that year. And so when I actually originally went to the sit-in, I was planning on going to the sit-in, going back to my room to pack up my bags because I was supposed to be leaving campus early the next morning just to grieve and get away from Amherst. And the minute that energy really started building, I remember my boyfriend at the time called me and he was like, "You're not leaving, are you?" And I said, "No, there's no way. There's very little that could pull me from this place now." And I first started getting more involved kind of around the time that they started calling people to the Center of Humanistic Inquiry to kind of start thinking about what are the needs of the community. Come up if you feel like you have something to say about, or just kind of anything you want to contribute to this conversation. And I initially went up because I was on the e-board of both La Casa and La Causa at the time. And so it was a bit of a no-brainer. For me, it was just like, all right, I'm going to go upstairs, at the very least, in my role as an e-board member. And I ended up staying there. I spent most of the next 4 days in the Center for Humanistic Inquiry in the G Center. And those 4 days were very intense because it was just kind of constant strategizing, constantly thinking about, who do we need to be talking to? Who do we need to be bringing into this? How are we communicating? Whether that be to press, to, senior admin, to other students. And it was very much a student movement. And so there was very much a need to make sure that the entire process felt democratic and for the people, by the people kind of energy, but also making sure that that energy was being harnessed and tangible things were happening, and things were happening at the efficiency that they needed to be happening. And I actually specifically remember having a conversation with a few people, including Professor Parham, on Friday night about that exact thing. How can we make sure that everyone feels like their voice is heard and that this is very much a student-based movement, while also making sure that demands are being made and progress is being made and things are being clearly communicated to senior admin, to professors, and to anyone who is looking for someone to say, what is going on in the library? What are the demands? What are X, Y, and Z? What are we doing? So there was a lot of that. And I realized very early on that the only way I was going to make it through the next few days was to make sure I slept in my own bed every night. So I would leave the library probably around 11 to midnight. I would go home, I would sleep, and then I would get up around 7:38 and go back to the library. And so that was really, it's weird because it's such a blur to me now, and I don't know that it ever didn't feel like a blur. I'm sure there was a moment where everything felt very sharp. But there are still a few moments that stick out. I remember that same Friday night that we had the conversation with Professor Parham. There were several of us counting, because it was a Friday night. I think it was a day and a half after the sit-in had started. We were trying to figure out how many people were in the library. We were counting. And I actually don't remember the final count, but everyone was kind of broken down into focus groups at that point. So everyone was sitting and kind of discussing different areas that we wanted the school to address. So there was kind of a group that was sitting and brainstorming about cultural competency. There was a group that was sitting and brainstorming about the mascot, kind of so on and so forth. That's a moment that stands out to me. There was going to the Williams game to protest. That stands out to me. I think I most vividly remember the very last day of the sit-in, because it really felt like everyone was just so exhausted by that point. It had kind of turned from a sense of urgency and momentum to this sense of deep-rooted exhaustion. And so I think the sit-in ended just as much for the students in the library as it did for any other reason, because people were really starting to feel completely worn through. Because a lot of us were really putting in our all, and not only were we students, but we were all people who had other things going on in our lives. I know I wasn't the only one grieving a family member during Amherst Uprising. And so I think there was kind of a lot of conversations the last day of like, how is this going to be sustainable? How are we going to sustain demands? How are we going to sustain follow through? How are we going to sustain students' energy and ability to engage in this? So that's kind of what I remember from the sit-in itself. And I think, everyone probably has a different feeling of when Amherst Uprising ended for them. I think for some people it was the sit-in, for some people it was much later. And for some people, Amherst Uprising is as much its legacy as anything else. For me, after the sit-in, there was all the homework, but then there was also several meetings. I don't know, I feel like there was somewhere between 20 and 30 students that were meeting relatively regularly to figure out next steps. Because one of the first things was there was a meeting with 2 members of the board that would be followed up with a meeting with the full board. So I was one of the students who met kind of on behalf of Amherst Uprising with Colin Murphy, who was the chairman of the board at the time, and I wish I could remember her last name. Her first name was Paula, I believe. And, we sat down in the inn and probably talked for an hour around there, kind of about just really what was going on campus. What did they need to be taking back to the rest of the board about the needs of the students and what was going on? I think there were 3 of us there, 3 students and 2 board members. And kind of what came out of that was, and the students, I'm not going to use last names because, everyone gets to tell their own story, but it was me, Milton, and Mercedes who were there. And then later, Mercedes and I would both be at the full board meeting in January, kind of to talk to the Board of Trustees again. So for me, even after the sit-in, Amherst Uprising was very much still a part of my life. It was something that I was very actively participating in, probably for at least another 2 months, maybe longer. I actually remember when I really stopped feeling like I was actively participating, and when it felt like the original momentum of Amherst Uprising ended and opened the door for new things, which I was sitting in Schwemm's with Mercedes and Lola, and I think someone had texted the Amherst Uprising group me about a meeting, but almost everyone was busy. And so we were just kind of sitting and talking. And I actually remember nothing about the conversation except that all of us were very tired and had a lot going on. And kind of agreed that organizing through this group me that had been used over the past few months wasn't the best way forward for us, just as individuals and as the movement. And movements have grown out of the initial Amherst Uprising moment. Things are happening, and everything that has momentum has momentum. The mascot change was very much in the works. The search for the chief diversity officer for Norm Jones was very much in the works. And OD&I would be built out of that. The presidential task force was built out of that, which I have my own thoughts on. But, the things that would go into committee and be stuck in committee had happened. The things that would move through committees and continue to be happening were happening. And that's the moment I stopped really feeling involved in an active way. And it kind of turned into more the impact for me. But I can't tell you exactly when that was. Definitely a few months after. But I think when I think about what was it like in Frost for those 4 days, it was just, like I said, intense. Strategy and talking and how, and really wanting this to be as successful as possible and really take advantage of the energy that was resonating through the student body as much as we could. That's what I remember about what it felt like in the library. I don't think that there's any version of myself that wouldn't have gotten as involved as I did. There's a version of myself that would have gotten a little less burnt out, but we can only learn and grow from those moments. But Amherst Uprising will always be important to me. The Amherst Uprising was it was both a continuation and a beginning of something new. Black and brown students and marginalized students at Amherst have been advocating for their needs forever, as long as they've been at the college. I worked in the Multicultural Resource Center, actually starting the semester after Amherst Uprising, which again was started from student protest. So Amherst Uprising the legacy of it is very much a continuation of resistance and of naming needs by students. But I think the original slogan of Amherst Uprising is actually very kind of spot on for how I think about it. Radical compassion, and what I think its legacy should be is there was really a moment of radical compassion. I think a lot of people felt like their eyes were opened to different realities, whether that be good or bad. I know myself and several other people definitely lost friends during this time, but also gained a lot of strong connections and a lot of incredible community. Yeah, and I think it created such a strong sentiment that, as I said, I still feel it a little bit when I think about it. I still feel some of the energy that came from it. But I think it definitely taught students that whatever, especially Black and brown students, and I also want to very much acknowledge that Black women were integral to Amherst Uprising at every single step. From the sit-in to all the momentum and movement and demands that followed. I think that is very important to acknowledge. But I do think that the legacy should be of the potential for students to come together, the potential for students to really leverage their voice and their energy and their power on campus. And understand it as like part of what Amherst is and has been and will be, because the work is never done, and there's many things from the original list of demands that were taken from lists of demands or appeared on lists of demands from decades ago that are still not accomplished. You know, the work is never done. The ball has to be kept rolling, but it happens in waves. It happens in different parts of the community. It's always happening somewhere. But every now and then, I think there's a spark, and what can come out of that flame is really amazing. And that's kind of what Amherst Uprising was, at least for me. And I want to really thank Andrew as well for doing this project and asking me to give an oral history, because I think it is really important to remember and to archive, because that's also something we talked about a lot, is there can be a lack of institutional memory. So it's really important to document what happened and how it happened and all of those things. In a lot of ways, Amherst Uprising gave me a lot of love for Amherst. It also invigorated me to push back against Amherst, and I'm also very grateful for that. So, thank you again.